I'm Lau Branson, and this video will include a number of stories that are about leading change in congregational life. And these all focus in one way or another on how a congregation begins to experiment with connecting with neighborhoods, neighbors, their environment. And this isn't about large strategic plans or programs. This is more about how do we pay attention to what God is doing around us. The assumption is that God's ahead of us, that God's involved in our neighborhoods, that God's involved in the individuals around us. And so the question often then is for a church to figure out, how do we engage that? How do we discern next steps? How do we become aware of, hospitable to, listeners of what the Spirit of God is doing? In most of these situations, there is some kind of intentional attention on the part of the congregation. And so sometimes they'll set up something called an action learning team, an adaptive change team, something like that. And the idea is that two or four couples or half a dozen individuals will get together, and then in a process of doing lectio with scripture, of praying together, of naming the ways that they're involved in a neighborhood, naming where they already have connections, and then praying and listening to the Spirit of God. And then just in particular days or normal daily life, just asking God, show me where you're at work and that you want me to pay attention. Show me where you want me to notice what it is you're doing. Help me to participate in your Spirit's generative work in my neighborhood. One elder at a fairly large church was part of a team like this, and he simply started praying as he went out into the community, walking his dog, that he would simply become aware of what was going on and be aware of what God was doing. And he wasn't long into his walk when he was a block away and noticed an elderly woman who was mowing her lawn and not having an easy time of it. And so he introduced himself and he said, I've got some time. Can I do that for you? And she was very grateful for that. And so she stepped aside, held the dog leash as he continued to do this. And as they chatted, he learned that her husband had passed away not very many weeks before that, that she didn't have any family nearby. And so he just said, well, why don't I come back and do this again next week, or however often it may need that. And in the meantime, she'd brought out some coffee and they chatted briefly. And then after that, he went on his way with his dog. When he came back a couple weeks later to mow, and as he was mowing, some other neighbors stopped and said, well, how is this woman doing? Some of them knew her. And he said, we just chatted briefly. And I said, I'd take care of her lawn. And he said, and one of these neighbors then said, well, I'd be glad to do that too. Do you want me to come back in a couple of weeks? Well, when that happened, this even knowing that somebody else was mowing the lawn, this original lawnmower dog walker stopped and chatted with this neighbor. And over a period of time, as different neighbors became connected, the amount of coffee the woman was making was increasing, and this became a fairly regular gathering of neighbors as they talked on these Saturday mornings and began to develop relationships that had simply never existed before. And because the gentleman who had begun this was always praying that God would show him what God was up to, other than just good caregiving, good neighbor life, there began to be some times where there would be questions about, what do you normally do on weekends? And he was able to say, well, I'm part of a faith community. And the conversations went from there. And they ended up doing both recreational types of things on the weekend, as well as others expressed interest in the faith community. In another church that was just starting to ask these questions, far before there were even any action learning teams, a woman who had just come off the general board, the administrative board of the church, was at home one evening, and again, it's a situation where a husband had passed away, and she was looking around her house and wanting to change things around, and standing in her dining room and looking at dining room people, and her adult daughter came in. And the mom said, I want to get rid of this table, I want to make this into a different type of room, and the daughter was just aghast that this table that she'd had so many memories about was not going to be there. And so she said, Mom, you can't get rid of this table. And her mom said, I really want to have kind of a den, more other kinds of chairs. And the daughter said, well, can we just keep it? Can we put it in the garage? The garage is empty. I have no idea how they had an empty garage. I've never seen that. But anyway, the mom said, sure, let's do that. And so they got a little bit of help and moved it out into the garage. As her daughter left, she decided just to make, again, a cup of coffee for herself and had the garage door open. It was a nice day, and she was sitting there at the table in the garage having a cup of coffee. And a neighbor who she'd seen passing by more than once, but had never met, was walking by and waved. And she waved back and says, do you want some coffee? And the woman said, oh, sure, I've got time for that, and came back and sat down at the table in the garage on the driveway. And they chatted briefly about their lives. And again, this woman was involved in a prayer practice of, God, what are you doing? What do you want me to pay attention to? And then as they chatted into the time, the neighbor left. The woman thought, well, I kind of like it out here. And so a few days later, she was having a cup of coffee at the table, and this neighbor, along with a friend, was walking by, and she says, "Oh, there's Sally. Let me introduce you." And so they all sat and had coffee. Notice how these things kind of revolve around coffee. I'm sure there are alternatives. And as they talked, and then left, the neighbors left, and they said, "Well, we'll see you next week." And this was getting to be a regular, particular day of the week, and as the woman that next week got there a little earlier, she just knocked on the door, said, I'll get the coffee, just come out whenever you want. And this became, again, a way that a community was meeting. Both these stories speak to something that's happened in many of our North American cities. And that is, we've lost gathering places. Sometimes there are community centers, libraries, coffee shops, shopping malls that do become places for this to happen, but often those require driving. And so what we're seeing is that if there are walkable, known, hospitable places for people to gather, that this is what happens, that people want stories. They want to hear about each other's lives. They want to care about each other's lives. And again, as the pastor talked to this woman saying, do you want to be on one of these action learning teams? And she said, actually right now, I'm just trying to get to know my neighbors, and I'm learning how to tell stories. In another church that had an annual event, just a fall fair, rummage sale kind of day, and they'd been doing this for decades. And the board of the church had become aware for a long time that their church really didn't, none of them lived in the neighborhood anymore. They were all commuting in multiple miles. And in fact, the ethnicity of the community was very different than the ethnicity of the church. And they had a desire to start making some connections, and were pretty unsure how to do that. And so they decided that their experiment was going to be, before this annual fall event party, that they would at least knock on the doors within 1 block in each direction, and maybe it was 2 blocks. And basically they knew that on that Saturday, because more and more people came in, that they really did mess up the parking for the day. And so they just thought, okay, we're going to cover these blocks. We're going to go out with free meal tickets for the food at the event, and just apologize for the parking, give them our phone number in case anything's not working well on that day. So they started doing this. And a good friend of mine who went to the church, Ivy, was about half a block away and knocked on a door. And a woman through the screen door just said, yes, can I help you? And my friend Ivy said, well, my name's Ivy, and I'm from the church just across the street. And the woman behind the screen started laughing. She said, that's really funny. My name's Ivy, too. You say you go to the church down the street? And my friend said, yes, we're having our annual festival next week, and we just wanted to give you a free dinner ticket, and just wanted you to know you're very welcome. And neighbor Ivy said, "You know, that's interesting. I've lived here for 20 years and I've seen your church. And on Sundays, I see people drive in and get out of their cars and go into church and get back in their cars and leave. We see you have funerals, and we see at the funerals you drive in and you get out of your cars, have your funeral, and then you leave. We've been wondering, notice the plural we've been wondering when you would get connected, when you'd come out, when you'd meet any neighbors. We just didn't know if that was something that you cared about." And my friend Ivy just thought, "Oh, we are not good at that, but we want to get better at that." And the next week, when they were doing Walk in the Neighborhood again, my friend Ivy asked the pastor, "Would you just join me to meet this neighbor, this other Ivy?" And so they went back to the other neighbor Ivy's house, and knocked. And my friend introduced the pastor, and the woman said, "Well, Pastor, we're glad that you're reaching out into the neighborhood," and kind of gesturing across the street. "Did you know that Mary's husband passed away just a couple weeks ago? I'm sure she would like to meet you. And have you yet met the Andersons next door? They just moved in a couple of weeks ago." And so here was a neighbor who knew the neighbors, who's glad to introduce my friend and her pastor to the neighborhood. And she knew what was going on, and the church, as they would say, just had no clue about what was going on a block away. And over the next months and year, these connections became much deeper and better. In a church that my wife was working with for a number of months, or a number of years, they'd been involved in just starting some action learning teams. And one of these action learning teams just thought of an experiment. And so Nina asked him, "Tell me about your experiment." And so the small group said, "Well, first of all, you need to know that we already do some things as a group. There's a retirement home about half a mile away. And so about once a month, and sometimes a little bit more often, we take a meal to the retirement center so that the cooks can have an evening off. They often, it seems the weekends aren't as well quite organized, and we kind of enjoy doing that." And so Nina said, "Well, that's great, but what's your experiment?" And they said, "Well, we've been doing this for a number of years, taking a meal over. And we decided our experiment is that when we take the meal over, instead of sitting by ourselves, we're going to actually sit with the people who live there." And admittedly, Nina had to stifle a laugh, just being aghast that they had been taking meals for ages and never sitting and having a meal with anybody. And so she just straight faced it, "That's just really a wonderful idea. Why don't you do that, and then we can talk about it when we're back together." And so that's what the group did. And it was summer, and if I remember right, they were doing this, some persons of this group, it kind of changed week by week, but they actually during summer months were doing this every Saturday evening. And normally, though, this group took August off. And the first week of August, the church gets a phone call from the retirement center. That had never happened before. This had been kind of a one-way, we take care of you kind of relationship. And they said, "You know those nice people that come to see us? We heard they're on vacation, and we wondered if any of them are around because we'd love to have them back. And we could even work at calling out for food, but we just would love to have them back." And so this is what had happened, that there actually became some kind of collaborative work around food, but it became more about the relationships. It became more about conversations. All of these stories lean in different ways into both discerning what God's up to, but listening enough in a story to know when there's time to talk about faith, to talk about Jesus, to talk about life that is blessed by God. And in each situation, these are different, because it depends upon the stories you're hearing. So just as in Luke 10, as they would hear the stories of the village, then they would know how to talk about the kingdom. They would know when to pray about healing. They would know how to engage these people. And that's what was going on in all of these stories. So it's a discernment, but it's action learning, because you really can't learn until you're engaged in the community. And it's in the midst of that God reveals God's self and begins to show the way forwards for God to be even more revealed in those communities and to be invited in more fully.